Hello, and welcome to the Everyday Business Problems Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Crysler. Each episode, we talk to business leaders and subject matter experts to learn about the challenges they've overcome and the challenges they still face. You'll hear fresh insights, real talk, and get inspiration to grow your business. Hey everybody, excited to be welcoming back Cody Fisher to the show for episode 2 of our 3-part series on transforming the healthcare supply chain. Cody is the president of Concordance Innovations, where he leads the Surgeon's digital platform and drives strategy across the healthcare supply chain. He spent his career at the intersection of finance, analytics, and innovation with leadership experience at Concordance, Cardinal Health, and PNC. Cody brings a sharp strategic lens and a practical understanding of how systems and partnerships really work, and looking forward to the conversation. Cody, thanks so much for coming back on the Everyday Business Problems Podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be back, starting the year fresh. Already well into it, so happy to be here. Happy to continue the discussion.
I love it. It is amazing how quickly time goes by. So
it's kind of wild.
So, episode 1, we kind of unpacked at a really high level, some of the challenges that obviously, you've seen from the macro, from your experience, the work you guys are kind of doing from a surgeon's perspective today. And I thought what made a lot of sense for episode 2 is to kind of really get into the weeds with this, talking about some of what, folks in and around supply chain healthcare more specifically are kind of dealing with, right? So, it kind of set the tone for that. I thought probably one of the best questions to open this up was, it's like most people, especially in leadership function, don't kind of wake up and say, oh, I'm so excited to put out fires all day today. But yet somehow we find ourselves doing that more times than not. So, why do you think that it's just so hard to break away from that kind of general firefighting mentality as it relates to supply chain and again, more specifically from the healthcare perspective?
It's a really good question, fair question. I'm glad you asked it to me today instead of in part 1, because I think I'll have a different answer, which is crazy. But maybe it's a testament to, I think part of it, to acknowledge the challenge for healthcare supply chain, is it is complex. I mean, the organizations on the, let's just say the provider side, I mean, on a daily basis, they have tens of thousands of open orders. Like, it's hard. Even if we say, there's 1% of our open orders have a challenge, like it ends up being a lot by itself.
Yeah.
And then you combine that with, I'm getting thousands of requests from my very complex customer base inside my health system. Like, where's my order? Where's my product? How much do we have? Where can I get it? Can I get a sub? Like, all this stuff just like adds on top. So long story short, I think first and foremost, we have to recognize like we are dealing with a pretty complex ecosystem, to not use a kind of an overused or a general word there, but it is complex in nature. I believe what also drives a lot of the urgency or the firefighting feel is it is really difficult for organizations to manage what is a fire today versus what is a fire Friday versus what is a fire next Wednesday. And if you don't know precisely why those different fires have different levels, then everything is a fire today. So I think it's the combination of, we are dealing with a very complex world, the urgency around what we're dealing with, delivering patient care and taking care of our clinicians that deliver patient care, inevitably means more times than not, we're in a scenario, or people within healthcare supply chain are in a scenario where they can't say, I'll figure it out next week, right? Because figuring out next week may not save the life today or in an
real
hour.
World impact, right?
Right. Or take care of people that are doing so. So I think it's that combination. Like, it is complex, but the urgency to solve problems and maybe the repercussions if we don't solve those problems is real. And it's very impactful to human life versus that of like, did a product leave the production line? right? Or did that chip get put in the truck? Like, has real world financial problems, but very different when we're talking about human life
Yeah.
impact.
Yeah, I think that's, it's a great lens to look at this. And I think sometimes, again, just the macro, right? Sometimes we don't give ourselves enough grace. And to your point, this stuff is complex, and more specifically within the healthcare space, just to your point, tens of thousands of orders, how many lines, how many SKUs, how many different moving parts, right? And then again, just all of the real world impact. I think that's, spot on. And again, not to say that we shouldn't give ourselves some grace in terms of the general scope, because we do have to balance that real world impact, and knowing that if we aren't prioritizing specific action items and systemization and, change management, right, we're really going to have some massive, negative consequences. Right. Yep. So, yep. and far more reaching than somebody not receiving a widget. So
absolutely. Yeah. And if you had asked me 30 days ago, 60 days ago, I probably would have started with the technical answer, right? Of, hey, systems aren't integrated, data's not visible in one spot. But for whatever reason, starting the year, I'm very much, to your point, start by giving ourselves some grace, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be urgent in solving for those root problem challenges.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a balance there. I think another aspect of this, I'd love to get your take on, but, I kind of think through those challenges and like the macro of this, right? Like for me, it's kind of, you've obviously got the systemization aspect of it, right? But that really is kind of like, you've got two sides of that. You've got the change management and culture piece of that. And then you've got the other, kind of pace of change, and whether that's related to the technology advancements that we are seeing, right? Or just the sheer complexity of the organization and the system that we're ultimately, trying to untangle. So, maybe you could shed a bit of light on how you're putting, like how you're thinking through that from the experience that you have, and kind of more specific to the stuff that you're seeing with the surgeons team, as you're starting to navigate these conversations with folks.
Yeah, it's actually a well-timed question, Dave. I'll actually start a little bit like internally. Maybe I'll start with myself personally, and then the team, kind of internal team aspect, and then kind of transition overall to how we see organizations kind of buckling up for this like wave of innovation, right?
Yeah.
So starting personal to me, I'll use that analogy throughout. Maybe my answer here or my response is, whether it's a mental preparation or something of that, like, I have literally kind of said, let's buckle up for this innovation ride. So what does that mean to me personally? It means things like, leveraging AI in my own personal development, right? And kind of talking and training. And, I feel like I've mentioned this to some of the leadership team the last couple of weeks. I literally feel like since the beginning of this year, personally, I have built a 20 to 30 person team around me, but they don't have names. They're called agents, and they do things like in the shadows, right? But they're helping me think, they're helping me research, they're helping curate messages, they're helping me refine messages. After I give messages, they're helping me refine those, right? And, challenge me. So it's like I have these like worlds of coaches and this like shadow team. So that's my own personal version of like buckle up and get ready or buckle up and enjoy the ride, maybe is the better way to say it. I think for me personally, it's kind of embracing technology and embracing innovation. Yes, we have to understand it. I have to understand it. You can't use it in ways that are going to harm any of us personally or put any of our organizations at risk. But I think the longer people, and again, kind of starting at the individual level, the longer we resist the tools that are actually at our fingertips and how fast those are changing, the risk is not innovating isn't going to mean you stay in the same place. It actually means you're going to fall behind, again, at this level, people, if I use myself, and the gap between the users of innovation or technology and the gap and those that don't use it is going to widen, and it's going to widen arguably by the hour,
Yeah.
not by like the week or the month or the quarter, but like by the hour. If you're not using technology to change and to innovate and to increase productivity, by the hour, you are probably falling behind. The gap is widening. That is also then the message internally within surgeons is, said in different ways. Like, how do we clone ourselves, right? How do we make those hard, repetitive tasks that are time consuming automated? So it's interesting to kind of say it this way, but it's like, as an innovator and an organization where we're trying to collaborate with the thought leaders of the industry, like we're doing the same internally, right? We are looking at our own internal champions to say, how are you increasing productivity and scale that within the team? How are you leveraging certain AI and automation tools, scale that within our organization? And not that our organization isn't just going to simply grow by number of resources as well, but it's this combination effect where one person can have the productivity of 5 and we scale people in terms of numbers. So this isn't like we hear a lot of times like replacing, labor and stuff like that. For surgeons internally, it's more about scaling the impact we can have, scaling the productivity we can have internally, but ultimately then leading to our customers, our future customers, the industry at large. So my comments there, Dave, probably where your question was actually pointed was, what do we see organizations do and how are they innovating and kind of bringing in that change management and culture? The organizations we've seen or I've seen be successful, the tone is starting at the top, right? It's kind of giving the space to be innovative and simultaneously setting the expectation that, not only can we change, we are expected to change. You are expected to leverage the tools and to bring ideas in ways to increase productivity, to increase efficiencies, to increase data and scalability, whatever that kind of talk track may be. Yeah. But we've kind of seen this combination, right? So the tone at the top, if you will, or kind of the tone that is defining the org. And then when you have those internal champions, so I mentioned, the theoretics of a few people inside surgeons where they're thought leaders within different domains or using different tools. It's the same thing we see in our customers. You get that super user and they're like, oh my gosh, I just figured out actually how to use this tool that's at my fingertips. And it doesn't have to be surgeons, right? It could be Copilot, it could be ChatGPT, it could be Gemini, it could be, UiPath and some automation, right? When they figure it out and they're able to tell their wins, and then the light bulbs just start clicking all around, right? So this combination effect of set the tone, build the culture around expectations and creating the space to innovate, right? And not making it a danger zone, but then also, if I would be sharing to folks that maybe don't have the opportunity to set the tone at the top, if you will, it's like start by using and deploying, and as small as something may seem, it goes from small to incredibly large really fast. And that compounding effect of how a simple idea can grow and scale is pretty amazing.
Yeah. I mean, so much, just so many great things that you shared in there. I think for a lot of folks, right, it's this idea, and you touched on this a bit, right, but it's this idea of just continuing to experiment, continuing to learn, regardless of the tool set, right? Like, I think you and I align the tool set, whether we're talking surgeons, whether we're talking some other platform, some other tool, those will continue to iterate, continue to change, continue to, exponentially be more valuable and ultimately powerful, right? But this idea around getting comfortable, learning a new skill, kind of looking for some of those small wins that build momentum just in your own sphere, right? And whether that's professionally, whether that's personally, I mean, I know people building out GPTs to, do recipes based on what's in their refrigerator, right? Like it's just sky's the limit. It's so wild.
Hit the nail on the head there. We've done it.
It's such a cool time. When you start to embrace some of that, I think, to try to tie this back, what I'd love to hear, and maybe you can talk about this internally, because I think externally folks will be able to make the connection, but like internally from a surgeon's perspective, right? How do you guys kind of navigate both the culture element, right? So you're a team of innovators, right? But I have to imagine that there are still some folks that are some laggers in terms of adoption and really, connecting all of the dots. It happens everywhere. So I'd love to understand like how you guys are navigating some of that change management, culture piece. And then the other part of that question really revolves around this idea of like, because we're so focused and prioritizing these things, what stuff gets, pushed down to the end of the list, right? And how do we ultimately find that balance?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And again, timely as we start the year. And, if my team ever listens to this, they're going to say, yeah, Cody talks about increasing productivity, but I don't mean work harder, right? There's only so many hours in the day, and there's only so many days in a month where we can just like work endlessly, and then all of a sudden you run out of gas and you need to recharge, right? So it is, I by no means am going to say it's easy for surgeons, right? Or any organization. I think we'd all want to say, we don't have any laggards, right? We are high powered innovators. We all think the same, act the same, have the same motivations, but at the end of the day, we're all people. And even if that is a generally true statement, that doesn't mean we're all innovators every day. That doesn't mean we're all firing at 100% every day, right? What does make it, relatively speaking, easier for surgeons is the why we exist and what value are we bringing to our customers because we exist in the way we do. It does make the urgency to innovate much more real. And kind of that spirit of scaling productivity and scaling our impact. So, for organizations, I guess and I don't want to be too soapboxy here, but if it's hard to define your why and why is it important to scale productivity and why is it important to scale impact and bring value faster in whatever way, shape, or form that looks for any organization, if you can't define your why, it kind of makes it quite a bit more difficult, not a little, to motivate, like create space and time to be innovative, and to leverage tools that you haven't ever figured out before. Right. So that's a little bit on the culture side. We get a little bit easier because we literally are expected to be innovative and expected to bring incredible value and incredible results as fast as we can. So like by the nature of the expectations placed upon us, we kind of have to innovate. With that said, there are for sure, folks within the team, and this could be on a day or a week or just generally how they're wired where, I want to see somebody else do it, right? I want to see somebody else kind of do, I want to see an innovator kind of push the boundaries and then prove it's true. And I'll be a fast follower type thing. Right.
Yeah.
And it's good for us as a team to have this flex a little bit because if we had a team of me, I would like be stretching the boundaries and I'd stretch so far, we probably actually would have like no core, like communication system or no core content management. Right. Cause I'm just like out here wandering and pushing the boundaries with all these crazy tools. So that combination, I think is important. I think it is also important to balance the, for lack of better terms, the carrot and the stick, right? Like, what's in it for the person to be more productive. And there's two ways to approach it. And I think most leaders would like to approach it from the carrot, right? Like, if we're more productive, if you're individually more productive, X, Y, or Z good things happen for the organization, for you personally. I do, unfortunately, I think for humans, sometimes the negative reinforcement is unfortunately the things that instigates action faster. And I'm not going to recommend it, but I think it needs to be a balance, right? Like what if your organization has set the tone to innovate? What if your organization has set the expectation that we need to increase productivity and go faster? Again, doesn't mean working more hours in a day. It means scaling and leveraging tools. If that doesn't happen, then what? And to me, that embodies the culture, right? Like I think great organizations identify really quickly when employees aren't a good fit. And that doesn't mean the employee's bad. It just means it's not a good fit. I call it like dating. Like if you go on your first date and you're like, hey, this isn't going to work, like, we don't need to go on 5 more dates, right? Like, let's just call it good. Like, we can still be friends and support each other. And I think it's really difficult, right, for organizations in this period of time, because we're caught in this, like, and this is less about surgeons now, but we're caught in this, like, is AI just going to replace jobs? Is AI going to enable the best users of AI to scale productivity? And, it just helps companies flourish even faster. And I think it's a combination of both, right? Like, there are going to be roles and positions where AI and automation and all the fun stuff that goes with it is like, it is better than any person can be. And the people either have to figure out how to leverage it or not. And I don't mean to be like super pessimistic in it, but, those are just some of again, it's easy to embed in our culture, right? Of increased productivity to value, own it, leverage it, do what you can as fast as you can with all the tools that are at our fingertips. But there's a lot of organizations that struggle, and probably comes up in our conversation later of like, then how do you deploy it? Like, that's a whole nother thing. Like, we're kind of like, how do you prepare now? Which is hard enough itself, but now how do you deploy it and really scale is a whole nother separate conversation. So apologies for the long-winded. It's a really good question. One we think about a lot.
Yeah. Again, ultimately, I think, this is stuff that I'm seeing across industries, right? This is a hot topic. Mm-hmm. And I think, and you touched on it, right? Whether we want to use like, what's the why, what are we even showing up to do this thing for to begin with? Yep. And we tie it back to that, whether it's, creating immense clarity around what's the problem we're here to solve, right? Yep. Which obviously relates to the why. And I think one of the gaps I see with folks, so I'm glad you brought this up, but it's just this idea of connecting all of those dots for the team, right? It's one thing to say when you're in a leadership position, we're innovated. It's part of our, it's integrated into our value prop. That's our why, right? It's another thing when maybe you're a bit outside of that. So maybe focused on like, some of the providers, let's say, within the healthcare space, how they go about articulating that same, what's our problem? How do we utilize these tools that are available to us to support the efforts? How do we encourage folks to experiment, within kind of a safe space, right? Like that's, we've got all kinds of compliance and, cyber issues to navigate with that. So it's like, there's so many of these complexities. It's not just as simple as, we're AI first and we want to be innovators. It's like, okay, great. Well, what does that even mean?
Yep. Yeah. And Dave, something I didn't say and probably should have led with this, been very top of mind for us with insurgents. And, I think one of the ways that we are positioning surgeons as an internal organization, as a team, collection of teams on this journey is nobody is above the need to be more productive and the expectation to use automation and tools. And so said another way is one way we're in kind of invoking this and bringing it into our culture even further is like we as, call it leaders or managers, whatever it may be, we have the highest expectations placed upon us of how do we scale first, not, how does engineering scale and how do you automate code? And then, how do you automate like communication with customers and new customers and the industry? How does marketing automate, marketing material and content? No. It starts with us. It starts with me first, right? Yeah. Is show, create expectations, create the vision, but then show by demonstrate. So there is nobody in Surgeons that is telling or asking anybody else to be more productive without doing it first themselves.
Yeah.
And I think that is something that's been true.
You got to walk the walk, right?
Yeah, walk the walk, right? Like it's one thing, like we were talking, to paint the picture, paint the vision, bring clarity to it, bring the why. There's no faster way for that vision to turn really dark and ugly when it's, everybody's walking the walk except Cody and ... right? So, as you mentioned a couple points there, Dave, that's probably the point I missed most. And it is the one, we could sit here and have a whole session on things Cody's doing personally to be better and leverage automation and scale. as much as I can.
Yeah.
So, I think that's important, right? From a leadership perspective is, don't create expectations you're not willing to walk into yourselves. And I think your org will follow you much faster if you do that.
Yeah. I completely agree. I think, maybe one of the kind of next places that my mind goes, and I'd love, again, to maybe take that same kind of lens, right? Maybe specific to the stuff that you're seeing personally with the experimenting and the things that you're doing, and then maybe to surgeons, and then, kind of more broadly healthcare. But I have seen it personally. I have had a lot of conversations around it, but, the question really centers around some of the, implementation, some of the tool usage and this experimenting, right? Like can sometimes add more chaos than it, calms or eliminates. So I'd love to just get, maybe unpack that a bit from your perspective, like some of the things that you've been trying to do that maybe aren't as successful, that maybe you've recognized, hey, even though this we still need human in the loop, or how you're utilizing some of the tools, maybe from a pure, thought leadership partner, right? Like I need this tool to help me think more critically about this. Versus I'm going to assign some automation and, just let it kind of run wild. So I'd love to maybe just unpack that a bit.
Yeah, it's a really good question, Dave. And at this point, and I'll start personal, at this point in my journey around leveraging AI tools, right, or automation in general. And I'm this from the first conversation, I'm a pretty big proponent of like, it can look like AI and it can talk like AI, but it's really a math formula and logic behind the scenes, right? So kind of separating that a little bit, right? Like some of these comments I'm really going to put in the AI bucket of like, hey, I sent a prompt to Copilot or ChatGPT or Gemini and it came up with something crazy I never even thought of, right? Lesser to like, what's our inventory strategy and our order algorithm, and how do we predict risk based on like true algorithms versus like some very big, lofty, general prompt and a conversational interface. So the successes for me, I've seen when I am relatively speaking knowledgeable of what I expect the answer to be. I just don't have the time or the energy, or it's not a top priority to do the work. But it's like, it's kind of the, I could do the work if I just had time equation, right? Yeah. That has been incredibly powerful for me personally, right? And it could be, unpacking and building out commentary internally to our team around, hey, we're with a customer and we recognize the problem. I have a really good idea what the solution is. I do one paragraph on the solution, then I say extend on this, right? Like what would I need to think about to to basically translate the idea to an ultimate solution that is easy to communicate within now a world of many team members, right? That has been incredibly powerful because I know what I wanted to do. I just don't have the time or the kind of wherewithal, like the energy to actually do it while other priorities stack up. So it's that like thing that always gets shoved to the side of the plate. So automation has been incredibly powerful for me in that space. It's been incredibly powerful in the spaces where there are things that need done and I don't like doing them. For anyone that knows me, that is like responding to emails. I won't go too far down the path because I'd kind of tiptoe on the line of like, do I believe in automated communication or not? I believe that automation should help communication, but I think we still are people. So for emails, for me personally, again, anyone that knows me, I do not like emails. They are just an overload. Nobody wants to see my inbox. But bringing automation into the fold has in some ways made emails fun for me. And it just brings like a part of levity where it's like, oh, I don't have to think about everything. I can say, yeah, here's what I want to say. Help me articulate, blah, 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 blah. Right. Yeah. Especially outside of professional, if it's like utility companies and all the other things that I really don't like talking to. But it brings a kind of a that innovative approach to like very mundane tasks, right? So for me personally, it makes it kind of fun. I know that's weird and I sound probably pretty geeky to say that, but answering emails and kind of building commentary and stories and things like that are now fun for me, when they were one of the things that was a challenge of like creating the brain space to get into that rhythm. And then as we go from like, harder or easy kind of like mundane tasks, if you will, repetitive tasks, to the harder, more significant things for me personally have been in the event of like translate all these words in my head and help me articulate it into a clear vision, and all the way to, in the world of surgeons, like represent that in an application interface so I can better like, so there's levels of like difficulty and complexity. But I was, and this is outside the world of surgeons and outside of healthcare, but I was talking to somebody over the weekend, and through a series of automations, they basically stood up their, it'll create probably some competitiveness outside of our industry, but they basically set up their own self-built application, and they had to stream several automations together, but they didn't really have a great way to communicate between commercial teams and inside org and vice versa. So they said, hey, we're just going to spend a day and a night and do this. Right. Like, so I'll kind of give some of that, like, those are things personally that, there's easy tasks, those easy tasks stack up. Those are the fires of the day. If you can use automation to knock these out, and it could be simple of me responding to you saying, hey, this date doesn't work, but hey, can you look at my calendar and provide Dave the next date that works? Like, as simple as that sounds, like, what do we have? Like 300 or 400 of those things a day. So those, that, and maybe that's like kind of my message is like, just because it feels small doesn't mean don't do it. Like, build the muscle on things that can, one, build the confidence of, hey, I can leverage automation in whatever way, shape, or form that is. But also don't be afraid to take the swing at like, I don't even think Copilot could solve this for me. And it's like, oh, be careful what you don't think it can do. Right.
Right.
And the last piece, and I don't want to bucket this in advice, but it's just been my own learning, is like, it has really helped me when thinking about automation, and again, especially the conversational space, I am thinking about that shadow team that I mentioned earlier. I am thinking about them as like assistants with their own domain. When I thought about them initially, kind of sometime a couple years ago when I started this journey, it's like, I think I personally thought of it as, when I use automation and it didn't work exactly what I would do, I'm like, see, it doesn't work. It's broke.
Yeah.
And if you switch to say, if it's 90% correct, and you just have as a person to change 10%, like, how much faster and more productive can you be? It's the same thing. We can either look at the 10% of the reasons why it doesn't work, or we can look at the 90% of the way it helped us. So that is how personally I think I've elevated my personal growth and journey in leveraging automation, is looking at it as like a team of assistants without a massively high expectation of it has to be perfect in every way, shape, and form. And if it's not, I'm just going to click exit and say, I never want to talk to you again. So that has been my like personal trigger in my head. And it has absolutely helped me scale and be more productive, and arguably, I hope, be a better leader, because I'm also using it to help shape me personally around communication. So, a lot of ways, and we could go on and on.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, I think ultimately, folks that are listening to this, again, regardless of where they fall in the org, can take a bit of that, dependent on, how sophisticated they already are on their own, AI automation journey, right? And utilize that in a bit of a roadmap sense, because I think, again, it gets back to this idea of, experimenting. Can we deliver, can we get 80% of the way there, right? Like, one of the ways I love to use some of these tools is just talking to it, right? Natural speech. You can go on a 10-minute diatribe about something that you're you're trying to, say cohesively or with clarity. And, it has this ability to kind of cut through some of that. And again, utilizing it from a thought partner perspective, in some sense, has been a really massive unlock for me as well. So, yeah, I think all of that is really great. I think one of the other things I think about, and, kind of touched on this a bit, but, just from a pure kind of data aspect, right?
Sure.
Obviously, all of these things rely on data, and we can talk about structured versus unstructured. We can talk about, the plethora of tools and or systems that this data lives within. But how are you guys thinking about, the raw data elements of this? And again, I think this probably lends itself a bit more, focused on some of the folks that you guys are interfacing with from a surgeon's perspective, because you're probably getting a better picture of what exists across, the healthcare supply chain. But I'd love to maybe just touch on that a little bit, from a tactical perspective, how people should be thinking about this, some of the stuff that you guys are seeing, because I think, there's this macro lens, right? Of like, we don't have, clean data. We don't have the governance in place. We maybe have some, holes from a security or compliance perspective. So I'll kind of stop there and let you jump in. Yeah,
it's a really, well, I was going to say it's a loaded question because I think it is. I'll start with my watch out, and I always am leaning toward the silver lining, but I'll start with a watch out because I think it's important. I think in the professional world, and let's just say the healthcare supply chain, it is incredibly important to understand that just because we can use ChatGPT in our personal lives doesn't mean that is exactly how it's going to work when you put that model inside your organization. Because exactly what you said, Dave, right? The training of that model, the massive amount of training that OpenAI or Microsoft or Google or Anthropic or, pick your poison, the amount of training that goes into the models that are public versus the models and the LLMs we have access to within our professional experiences and the limitations we put on those models to ensure that our data is governed, which is a really important part. Like the expectations of, well, I did this in ChatGPT or I did this in Copilot or I did this on Google or I did this in Claude. Like for general users, it's really important to start to break apart the data. Like, and genuinely, like, at least have somebody that can talk to, like, what is AI and how does this thing work, right? So to break apart, like, the source data, to break apart the actual model and what is it trained on, to then break apart, like, well, how do you train it better and more and fast, right? And then also, like, what output do you want? What do you want it to do? And then kind of wrap that in a bow and say, well, what can this thing that you now built or are leveraging, like, what can it have access to and what can it? Right. So I think it's important to unpack some of that. Not that we will get into all of that here, but for kind of the general user, my watch out is just because, I'll use your example because my family does this all the time, just because you can take a picture of your refrigerator and say, what recipes can I make based on what's in here? And don't make it be last week's recipes or the week before. Like, we want it to be this type of flavor profile, and it will do it. Don't assume the, GPT 5.2 version that you have within some technology that you've loaded inside your four walls, inside of your organization, that you can take the same picture and it will do. Like, don't assume the results are going to be the same, because the model is the model is the model, and it's trained to do different things in different ways. So that's my watch out. I'll start there. The kind of the unpacking of the data component and the structured versus unstructured, I think my main message to the industry would be, we have to be able to think about automation to help clean data and to then leverage data simultaneously. So as much as we want our data to be perfect, that way the insights are perfect, you can reverse engineer it on non-technically speaking, to basically say like, help me clean my data first in order to do these things. Right now, again, it is all driven on, well, what data does it have access to? How has it been trained, et cetera. But this, like, I genuinely believe it's a fallacy to say, well, I can't get started in X, Y, or Z because I have bad data. Fine. We'll talk to you in 20 years and you're still going to have bad data. Right. Like it just is a fact. Like our data will never be perfect because data is not this like static thing, right? Whether we're talking about product information, whether they're talking about how we order, whether they're talking about locations and vendor names, or if you're a vendor and a manufacturer, customer names, customers are always buying, providers are merging and they're acquiring and they're opening up new facilities. Like data isn't static. Data is a living and breathing like organism in and of itself. It is always going to be challenging to manage because it does so. So the urge I would have is like, don't wait to get started. If you don't think you can use automation to leverage your data to create insights and signal, then use automation to clean it. And or at worst case, use automation to understand where you have the most significant gaps and then prioritize how you're going to fix and address it. That would be the urge of don't just put automation on top of the data. Think as like automation in your data as well.
Yeah, I love that. Kind of a follow-up question to that. I'm curious, like with some of the conversations that you guys are, like you and the surgeons team are having, are you seeing companies across the space start to leverage some of those tools that maybe are giving them some of those false signals, some of those challenges? Because I know I'm seeing that kind of more broadly speaking across industry. So I'm curious, from a more micro perspective, if that's a lot of what you guys are running into, or if it's even prior to in terms of like, boy, we don't even feel comfortable to do that because of, data and or some other factor.
Yeah, we are definitely seeing like factions within the industry where it's, I don't trust my data enough to even share it to one of my trading partners. Could be a customer, could go the other way, right? Could be a supplier. I don't trust my data enough to put automation on top of it because I think I'm just going to build a disaster, right? Or bad insights. It's like, okay, and I don't want to necessarily beat the drum of first principles, but it's like, okay, great. Like, what do we need to solve in order for that to be true?
Yeah.
Right. And just kind of continue to unpack like until we get to the lowest level thing to solve. I think that's a good practice for any person or any organization. I know it's kind of a polarizing like way to think at times, but we definitely have seen factions where, resistance to change with data being, dirty data being the reason like, oh, we can't innovate yet. When I mentioned earlier, the gap between, personal growth and if you're not growing, the gap is only going to widen, like the same message to those organizations. Like I hear you and I get it and I have empathy, but there's ways to address it. And if you're unwilling to address it, the gap between the orgs that are running the race of innovating, like, and not starting, like literally imagine that racetrack, like you're not starting, the race is going, like it is going whether you start or not. So, that would be kind of, are we seeing it? To answer your question, we do, but are we seeing, again, that's kind of the negative lean a little bit. On the positive lean, are we seeing a lot of organizations do a lot of things, even though they know they have fractures in their data? Yes. And that faction is way bigger. There are a lot of organizations saying like, I know I'm going to hit roadblocks or speed bumps, but I got to hit them. Like if I don't hit them, I'm not addressing them. And the more that we can know those areas of concern, the more that, we can kind of put some context to the insights and the workflows and the automations in those spaces. Like, say it's automating inventory, generally speaking, or insights around it. It's like, hey, if we think we have really poor inventory data in certain ways or bad order patterns or whatever it may be, it's like, you know what? Hey, take some of these insights with a grain of salt, but they're insights. Right. Like, and goal ultimately is the insights themselves can lead to uncovering where the biggest fractures are or most significant fractures are in the data versus just doing like deep dive data cleanses. It's like, well, let the insights drive like where to focus. And then, you know, you didn't ask this question, but do we see any organizations that have it all figured out? Nope. That's the easiest question. What I think, you know, to summarize maybe the journey that I think the industry is on, I genuinely think it is imperative for the industry to be able to think. And this is where we see kind of certain factions in the industry, like they are arguably running a race that the industry isn't even yet running.
Yeah.
So they're thinking 2, 3, 4, 5 steps ahead. And the further you can think about your why and what needs to be true in order to get there, what most organizations are doing is like stacking one block at a time. And then they're going to be like, oh, I didn't stack them in the right order. I got to bring them back down and restack. The organizations that are able to think the 3, 4, 5 steps ahead are stacking the blocks accordingly. Even if step 1 was a little bit harder, it's because they're ultimately trying to get to step 5, not just step 1.
Yeah, I mean, you know, again, great way to kind of reframe. And I think it really sets up, you know, the next conversation. So I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves there, but, you know, really taking kind of this tactical in the weeds thought process, the stuff that we unpack today, and thinking about what is that, you know, 5 steps ahead, right? Kind of looking at that strategic lens. And so, you know, bridging the gap to that. And I think ultimately, right, it comes back to a bit of what we said earlier, which is, you know, whether you want to call it the why, whether you want to, you know, get to root cause problem statements, it's those level of things versus this kind of tactical firefighting. I'm going to throw some stuff at it. And I think the other thing that we, right, just collectively people do when we see tools like this, things that are being launched, right, we immediately go to the replacement. Right. It's like, oh, this thing can do it. And it's like, no, let's just, to your point, let's focus on what we can get out of it. Can we get an insight that's 80% of the way there that we can further contextualize, that we can action somehow, right? Like that's the point we're trying to get to. And it's not this blocking and tackling at, you know, it's kind of the lowest common denominator. And whether that's data, whether that's, you know, process, whether that's tool implementation, whatever that, you know, piece happens to be, depending on context, right? Like now we're kind of getting somewhere. So
yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And I
love
not
it,
that
man.
I intended to use the building block analogy, right? But I really, I think it's important to start with block 1. Like just start, right? If you're not already like hands on keyboard doing stuff at a personal level, just do it. Pick easy stuff, right? Things to your point, Dave, where it's like 80% accurate or 80% better is like moving a mountain, right? Like just pick stuff. As an individual, as a team, and then as an organization, the better you can understand what is that 5th block, right? Like what is the big vision, the better decisions you're going to be making on what is block 1, what is block 2, what is block 3. So, you know, kind of start, you know, maybe that's the tie-in from some earlier questions, right? Is like, if you can clearly articulate the why, you have a much better idea of what blocks to start with. If you can't clearly articulate what 5 steps from now is, don't wait, just go. No, you know, not being in the race is a guarantee.
Sometimes it's better to break a few eggs along the way. Well, Cody, man, thanks so much for coming on the Everyday Business Problems podcast. Excited to get into this next conversation with you. But before we go, for any folks that are out there that would like to connect with you, where's the best place for them to find you at?
Yeah, throw me a message on LinkedIn. You know, if you want to learn more about Surgence, wearesurgence.com, but happy to connect personally and catch up, chat, talk anything at a personal level from automation or what's happening in the industry. If you're outside healthcare, also always love to brainstorm and learn what's going on and share best practices. It's all about getting better and moving faster.
Yeah, man. Awesome. Well, appreciate your time, and I'll make sure to put that stuff in the show notes for folks. And thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you so much for listening today. If we brought you any value, please rate, subscribe, and share our podcast. Also, be sure to connect with us on social media by searching @The Crysler Club. Until next week, I'm your host, Dave Crysler.